Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. I am Constantine Martelli, and I'm pleased to report that GSP has returned unscathed from his recall. So, we have him back, don't worry. He didn't croak, I didn't replace him. Everything's fine. This isn't a decoy, this is not his brother, this is not a body double. I can guarantee you that. I would not lie to you about such things. And we have quite a bit of news ahead of us. I'm glad you all enjoyed the episode that I did where I just had to drone on for an hour and a half by myself. And because I was a little nervous about that one, sometimes you run out of steam when you do it on your own. And I cannot match the autistic brilliance of your minutia minutes, so it was a rather bare bones one. And I think everyone's going to realize that they actually did miss the minutia minute, especially in the context of it being 1 year since the war has began. I think that all some valuable things. Now, in terms of actually taking a retrospective on that, that is likely going to be at a later point. Hopefully, we can. We have some plans for it. I don't want to get too much into in order
Yeah,
to have a more fleshed out show on this. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but for the main event, that's going to be a week or so, or maybe a few weeks down the road, depending on how everything works out with that. But we have plenty of news out of Europe, quite a bit of news even out of the US, some developing news out of Asia, and it's looking like a standard fare, a lot to get through. So without further ado, I will give the reins to you to tell us what has happened on the ground in Ukraine in the past week and a half.
okay. Well, let's begin with the South. There's been some back and forth in the Kherson region. Mostly it's the Russians, but there is not enough manpower. They're not going to make any serious attempt to retake Kherson. It is stable. There are artillery duels and the such, and then there's Zugladar. Apparently, I mean, if you go by said on Telegram channels, particularly Russian Telegram channels and even some Ukrainian channels, Russians have put more forces into Ugladar. Um, and the commander, I believe he's Dagestani origin. Um, he was actually stationed in Syria for a while. He won like a medal for, you know, a hero of Russia in Syria, and I think he also fought in Dagestan, uh, well, Chechnya. Um, Although the breakaway state that they created included parts of Dagestan, but he's been shipped off to the Eastern Front, and I don't mean the Eastern Front in Ukraine. I mean the Eastern sector will include Vladivostok. So he's out, and it looks like that there was bad planning. Um, in those videos, you do see that a lot of Russian tanks were hit. Now, it's interesting how they were hit because the Ukrainians, I think, played this very smartly. They went for the tracks. Now, if you watch like all the videos, you'll see that many of these vehicles eventually drive away, and there's almost no bodies at all anywhere. But what that did was it froze the mobility of the Russians, and they could not encircle Ugladar. And Ugladar is incredibly important. I would say it's the second most important front for Russia after Bakhmut, because if they capture Ugladar and Bakhmut, you're going to see a big rollout. Um, you're going to see the Ukrainians lose a lot of territory after that happens. And this is why it's the one theater where the Ukrainians will dump as many men after Bakhmut as they can. This is because of what I just outlined, even more so than the Kupiansk uh, Izium front that's being fought right now. Um, so there have been heavy losses of trying to take Ugledar for the Russians, heavy losses for the Ukrainians. but you can see how much the Ukrainians have prioritized this town, and this even a weirdness about it because this is a small coal mining town with high rises of all things, and they still found people living in it after like a year of conflict. There are still people living in there. I think the Russians evacuated several hundred. I think the Ukrainians have as well. So there are people that either they have nowhere else to go or they're still waiting to be liberated. Because we saw this when Soledar fell, and there have been evacuations out of Bakhmut. And of course, we saw it in abundance in Mariupol. So even Marinka, which is like devastated, there were still people there. Not a lot, but there were still several hundred there. And it's unimaginable that they would still be there. How they survive, I don't know. I
It,
mean,
it, it does
yes, we
raise a
know
bit
that
of
they,
a question when it comes to the topic of refugees, then, because if you look at what's going on right now, of course, the East is the most impacted by the war. Now, the entire country has been, as you've seen with the missile strikes, it has reached hell as far as Lviv, or Lemberg, I suppose we can also call it, but with name differentials aside, I know that Russia has been a rather large recipient of refugees, especially from those areas with a large amount of ethnic Russians. It only makes sense. But with a lot of the refugees coming westward, you do have to wonder how impacted they actually are by this war. Now, of course, I'm not going to be as callous as saying not at all, but when you have people, once again, still living in these towns that have been at the forefront of this war, not only for the past year, but for the past almost 10 years at this point, 9, 10 years, it does make you wonder what qualifies a refugee in that situation.
yeah, yeah. I believe Russia's absorbed just since last year close to 2 million. It's the most that any country has absorbed, but um, Poland is definitely a close second. And when you consider how much smaller Poland is to Russia, both in territory and um, population, it's quite a bit. Um, Overall, there's like between 8 to 9 million Ukrainian refugees uh, since the start of the hostilities last year. Um, but moving on with the front, there have been gains encircling around Avdiivka, both to the north and south. The Russians are now attempting to encircle Avdiivka as well. Avdiivka is a town very close to Donetsk, and the Ukrainians are very well fortified. That was like one of the pivotal towns that they kept as a linchpin against Donetsk City because it's so close. It's about almost as close to the center of Donetsk as a place like Pesky. So it's extremely close. Moving further north now to Bakhmut. So there have been a lot of gains. The Russians captured Yagodnoye today, or like actually yesterday, but it was in the evening. The day before, they captured Berehovka, and they also, of course, a few days before that, they captured Paraskoyevka, and they're closing in now on Bogdanovka. So that is from the north of Bakhmut. The Russians have really, really pushed far west now. That region itself, if you include all the little towns and the farming area, is as big as Bakhmut, the city itself. So what they're going to try to do is cut off the last roads completely. Now, all these roads, the Russians have partial fire control. That means they can hit the road in and at some areas. So transporting troops and material or evacuating is going to be difficult. From the southern front of Bakhmut, the Russians were pushed back last week a little bit, but they seem to have regained that territory. And now they're closing in on an area called Krasnoye, but I think the Ukrainians call this Ivanovke or Ivanovskoye. Same place. It's wedged between Bakhmut and Konstantinovka. But it's closer um, to Bakhmut in a sense. It's even closer to Bakhmut than Solodar was, and immediately next to it is Chasov Yar. So more progress has actually also been made into the city. Incursions that happened today have brought the Russians about 350 uh, yards from the center, what's considered the center of Bakhmut, which is a river and a road that runs north south. However, the east side where the Russians are is smaller than the west side. So, I guess it's the figurative center rather than, let's say, the actual territorial center. Uh, so that's been going on. And then there was a tweet that just came out late today before we recorded the show. This is Saturday evening. And it's from Noel, who has it's Noel Reports. He's very pro-Ukrainian. He has the EU flag and the Ukraine flag. Just received word that Ivanovske, south of Bakhmut, is being stormed by the Russians. Pray this is decisive. And it was at this point that Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka was struck by Russian missiles. So I think the Russians are, of course, they're very serious. They've had some small setbacks in taking Bakhmut about 5 days ago, but the last 3 days they are not slowing down. Um, and then it's you can sort of theorize maybe what's going on here because Prigozhin also mentioned that he emphasized that he wanted Bakhmut to be like a meat grinder for the Ukrainians. That doesn't necessarily negate the idea that they want to take Bakhmut. They do. But it is the pace because I still am convinced that what the Russians are looking for is a collapse within the Ukrainian military. And they want to draw out as much energy as possible from the Ukrainians, not only for taking Bakhmut, but for what essentially will happen after that, which will leave the Ukrainians Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka as the last holdouts, presuming that they also take care of Ugledar. But so I think because even with the amount of manpower they have now, I don't think they have enough to just conquer all the way to the Dnieper. However, I think what they want to do is because that would force them to have another partial mobilization, which I think is a possibility, definitely. But and if you go with Putin's speech that he gave a few days ago, one of the things that he mentioned was all soldiers will receive 2 weeks off every 6 months. That to me, he's implying this is going to be a long war. And he's also implying, also in the speech, it was, he had all sorts of things that he said about, reimbursing these families and taking care of them, whether they have veterans, whether they've had, um, a father or husband who's been killed or is, disabled as a result of the war. Um,
And
so
there were
my guess
previous
is,
promises of being given land in exchange for service. I think
yes,
that was end of last year, beginning of this year when that came out. So it was during. I think it might have been in October when he gave his annexation speeches for the uh, four regions that they had occupied at that point. So It does. I do concur with you that it does look like they are digging in their heels for a longer war or longer operation in general, whether that is the
Hmm.
same kind of warfare we see or some sort of reconstruction project or even a less conventional war with trying to integrate or reintegrate a lot of this territory, that they're in for the long haul and that they don't plan on this being a short operation and arguably never really planned on it being a short operation despite not having given that much of a time frame at first. And one of the other speculations given the speech, which I do have a few notes on the speech that I will cover
Hmm.
in just a minute here, but many people expect this to be an escalation from, at least insofar as Russian legal terms are concerned, a special military operation to a war. Now, I couldn't speak to the nuances of Russian law and how their military apparatus works to the point where I wouldn't necessarily be able to determine the difference of that, but I would imagine it would give them more leeway when it comes to mobilizations, troop numbers in the country, supply issues, etc. And I would imagine if this goes on long enough, it's going to be a matter of when rather than if. But yeah, you brought up some interesting points with the fact that yeah, there's probably going to have to be another mobilization at this point, and we'll see how the general public does react to it because even after everything, and once again, these are according to Polish firms, Putin is still pulling around 75-80% in all of this. So,
Yeah, I saw 79 on
oh
one,
wow,
and yes, so he's in a solid position right now, and there are still hundreds of thousands of troops just north of Kharkiv and some in Sumy. Will they be, let loose? My guess is if they do let them loose, it will only be at an optimal moment after um, Bakhmut has fallen. That's when I suspect that will happen. And really, as of the last 48 hours, we are much closer to that date. Of course, Bakhmut has a lot more civilians that still have refused to leave, and it's being encircled in a very similar way that we saw in Mariupol. Now, the question is, Mariupol was very much at the beginning of the war, and it was basically fully encircled by the end of March. And the only thing that the Russians had really had to contend with was, the Azovites and some Ukrainian Marines hiding in the Azovstal um, metallurgical plant. They were not controlling the streets of Mariupol. We saw, uh, people who'd been living in Mariupol attend Easter services. Um, they weren't dealing with roaming Ukrainian soldiers, uh, harassing them or shooting them. They were at ease, and really, the Russians basically just bombed the plant. There were some attempts to clear them out, but basically, they had cut off all access, and there were some failed attempts of the Ukrainians leaving. I think one of the most horrific ones that I saw was an MPV that had tried to go over a bridge, and it was fished out like months later, and I swear it was filled with like 10, 12 bodies inside. It was horrific. But would the Ukrainians be willing to do that again? I can say that if they lose Krasnoye, like I said, this is immediately next to Bakhmut on the southwestern section, in between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. It's going to be very, very hard for them to get out. They're going to have to roll over fields. So we could see something developing in the next, let's say, 48 to 72 hours, depending on how things go. Because of course now it will be much harder for the Ukrainians to get into Bakhmut and leave Bakhmut. And if they're going to play a game of attrition for the Russians, because they have fire control over many of these roads and fields, it will be easier for them to pick them off. So, I think they're looking for we saw a little bit of that when the um, Azovites gave up, surrendered in Mariupol. There were a lot of other Ukrainian soldiers that gave up, and at that point, the Russians hadn't even taken Severodonetsk and Lysychansk yet. They would 2 months later, but at that moment, the Ukrainians, still hadn't given up. Um, but they evacuated from there as well, and again, they evacuated kind of at the last moment from Lysychansk. And there were reports that they had severe losses. Of course, we can't confirm. I can imagine the Russians would still have air superiority, so I don't doubt that they would have taken a good number of them out. But you can't confirm it. But despite that, the Ukrainians have hung on, and it's kind of like, I suppose, they're going through their own idea of how many lives were invested in this to end in failure. And that sometimes, in and of itself, is enough of a drive to hang on. I think in the interim, of course, we saw the ideological units like Pravi Sector, Adar, Azov, who go there and, you know, basically enforce the will. And there's all kinds of crazy stories. While I was gone, I read an article in the New Yorker about an American and an Aussie that were killed in Ugladar, and they depict this battle where they went against the Russians with night vision goggles, and they fought and killed 12 of them. But then the sun rose. There were some things about this that didn't make sense, like really you fought for 6 or 7 hours based on. Anyhow, there was a part where um, they didn't feel welcomed, and they got into a firefight with Ukrainian troops. And when they got back, this is the part that didn't make sense to me. They went out, they did this. They 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 said they only wounded. I don't know, but they at least 4 casualties. And they came back to the base in Ugladar and said, "We won," and knowing full well that they just killed or injured, uh, you know, basically men on their own side. And so maybe they went out again. Like it's just the way it was written. There was something about it that didn't read right to me. And there was also a Polish contingent, and there are rumors that, like, from other sources, that there were 9 Poles that were killed there. The Russians also say that there's a female sniper in Ugladar that's very dangerous, and so on. So, anyways, that's sort of like an aside, but just to give you an idea of how crazy the situation is and how bloody it is. But moving on, in that whole area of Liman to Kupiansk. The Russians are now just 15 kilometers from Kupiansk. They have made gains in the north, and as I said, it doesn't appear that the Ukrainians are willing to throw in as many men into the northern front as they did before. You remember that after they first took a huge chunk, and Izium fell, and then Kupiansk fell, and then Liman fell. And the Russians were even pushed on the other side of the Oskol River. And they stabilized, and some people attribute this to Sorovikin. Sorovikin was made commander, but now he's been deputized. He's been this. It's not like the way the Russians fought in the Soviet era, where they would not recycle generals like this, but they've been doing this all throughout the Syrian war, and people speculate that that's because they want them to get training, because that's what you do with infantry, right? Or even mobilized infantry. You want them to get some experience, and then you get them out, and then you rotate and rotate and rotate. So learning on the job, as it were. But it's different when you have generals, right? Like, and in many ways, the public wants to see a successful general, and they want to have a face besides just the president's face that represents the war and its successes.
And if you
You
also
know,
want an example of why a high turnover of generals and officers is a bad thing, keep in mind that the U.S. had something along the lines of 21 commanders for 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying it is as bad as that or it's going to get as bad as that, but it makes sense when you have the troops that are
yeah.
actually doing the heavy lifting because you need to get them the experience. You need to give them time to decompress because, once again, these are highly stressful situations. You need to keep these people as physically and mentally healthy as you can. But when it comes to the people who are responsible for calling the shots that can either make or break this war, there needs to be more consistency there. And I suppose we'll see as time goes on what the turnover rate of generals are going forward.
I've heard it's every 3 4 months. It seems it's mind-boggling to me.
And I don't believe this, but I'm going to put it out there just for speculation's sake. And because this is also speculation, given post World War II American military history, that they don't want to make any one general too much of a figurehead, build too much of a cult of personality around that, because that does represent a potential political rivalry to the governing administration, whether it be the president, whether it be whoever else actually in the government. So I will throw out that out there. I don't know enough to either confirm or reject that, but that is also something to think about.
Hmm. That's a good point. Um, so the Russians are. I mean, there's an American general that often is brought up on the Duran called Vushinin, and one of the things he said way back in December was that if the Russians are in a rush, they're going to do, a big grab, or you know, I hesitate to say like a big arrow move, but they would flood Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of more troops. That would happen in the winter, probably February. And he said if they're not in a rush, they'll probably do it late March. I don't know. Uh, the one thing for sure is the Russians have never said that they're going to um, open up another front or increase dramatically more troops, other than the stuff that they're rotating and replacing right now. Of course, since the partial mobilization, for the first time, the Russians are fighting with equal amount of troops to the Ukrainians, in some theaters, even more than the Ukrainians. That's something that they've never enjoyed before. Um, so that's an interesting thing to see how it develops, because a lot of these guys, they didn't trickle into the front until December. So it's been 2 months now, 2 full months that they've been there, and there has been more steady progress for the Russians, but they're also they're fighting mostly in the most entrenched areas, and the reason I suspect that that's the reason that they're doing that is not just because that's where the most amount of Ukrainians are centered, but that those, like, after sort of you can basically uh stabilize the front lines. um the Ukrainians haven't been able to gain new territory since like the 15th of November. So that's 1 2 3 months now. So um I would say that, like, part of it is the attrition, and part of it is Russia cannot go and just get new territory, let's say in Zaporozhye, without taking care of the Donetsk region. Because I think One of the things we know about is the Donetsk city and the Donetsk region is every day it's being bombed. And the worst one that recently happened, I think it was either yesterday or today, was there's an ambulance facility, and the Ukrainians bombed it with a HIMARS, and it killed a medic, an ambulance driver, and an orderly. And it's just sick. Like in a city like Donetsk, like you're not, you know, killing the doctors there isn't killing the doctors that are working um on the soldiers. You're just killing the doctors that are trying to save the lives of the civilians you bombed the week before or the day before. That's what you're doing. I mean, that's what they've been doing for 8 years. So, because the Russians have been better able to uh, get their wounded out and go into military field hospitals. Um, you don't see the stories of them being rushed into civilian hospitals the way you do with the Ukrainians. Remember how much it cost the Ukrainians to get that part of Kherson, and you saw the videos of them rushing people to Nikolaev and to Odessa to get, and there were ads for blood donations. And then a little bit later, we saw the same thing happening in the Kharkov region, and they were rushed to Kharkov. Some of them even went as far as either Sumy or Chernigov. So,
And I
um,
remember in that whole time, and actually since the beginning of this war, that you've consistently had Ukrainian wounded flown to U.S. military bases in Germany.
oh yeah, there's that too. There's that too. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. So those are the front lines. The major battle is Bakhmut. The Russians are continually making gains every day. Um, they're more significant than the gains, let's say, around Ugledar or Avdiivka or Marinka. Um, and that has to be troubling for the Ukrainians because Bakhmut is far more important than Avdiivka, right? Losing Avdiivka will just mean you won't be able to bomb the city as effectively as you've done. But it won't, you know, that's it. That's all it will mean. You will not like that's a town that's not strategic, um, because it's surrounded on three sides. You know, the only way in and out is through the west, at least at this point. But that's all I have for the front lines right now. That's my minutia minute.
I well, thank you for that. It's wonderful as always, and it puts mine to shame. But I do have to say, not to get too much into retrospective territory, because I do plan on moving on, and like I said, I want to get that on a different program that hopefully would have a little bit different of a format. But this past year has made me reevaluate a lot of my preconceived notions about the way future wars would be conducted, because you can go back through old archives of the war report, and I had consistently said something along the lines of, we're not likely to ever see a third generation industrialized war as we saw, for example, in World War II or Korea ever again. And I do think, while that sentiment still holds true to a degree, even using Ukraine as an example, some of the events in Ukraine as an example for that, it has also proven to have been a very poor prediction on my part, because this is very clearly a functional, mechanized, industrialized war. Now, a lot of that is because of the constant support that is flowing into Ukraine. Although you could argue in some of the fronts that have been reduced to trench warfare, that has regressed to something of a second generation war between that and the extensive urban combat. But I had figured that the wars of the future were going to be fourth generation in nature, that we saw in places like Syria, places like Yemen, where it was non state and proxy actors primarily fighting these wars, with official peace reigning, but everyone has their stake in it and everyone has their group that they're backing. Now, once again, I suppose you could also say that about Ukraine, but comparing the U.S. response to, I would say Syria is probably the best example. You have a fourth generation war compared to Ukraine. In Syria, although we certainly didn't see eye to eye with the Russians and things were admittedly tense with the Russians to the point where you had American and Russian contractors actually in a firefight as recently as 2018, there was not the same narrative or rhetoric about Russia as there is involving the war in Ukraine, where a significant part of the population, I wouldn't say a majority, but certainly a significant part of the population, treats our support for Ukraine as a direct war with Russia, and they will, I'm sure many of you have been subject to this, they will call you a traitor, call into your question your loyalty over a war that we are not directly involved in. Now, that's once again not officially involved in because we are directly involved. There's no doubt about that. But there's a far greater understanding that this is a war that we've inserted ourselves into, as say, for example, Syria, which is just one of the many Middle Eastern interventions that we have, just one of the many troop deployments that we have to fight whatever militant group or keep the Russians in check or whatever. But this has taken it to a whole new level. And just out of this past year, I'll repeat, the thing I'm most shocked by is the return to this kind of warfare. Now, in retrospect, it seems very obvious that wars like this would be fought again, but getting so caught up in the conflicts that were going on before this, and many of which are still going on now, you wouldn't get the impression by looking at those and looking at the way the great powers of the world behave in those that we would ever see a return to what we see in Ukraine right now.
Hmm. Yeah, you wouldn't. I know, and I was guilty of that too. And part of the reason for that is that for 30 years, we didn't see a war like that. We saw America fighting against, much weaker countries, countries which already basically lost their military in the first Gulf War. Um, it was a question of stopping insurgents, guerrilla rebels, and that sort of thing. Some of the tactics that we see here in taking cities, though, in Ukraine resembled those that were carried out, particularly in Aleppo, but that's where the similarities stop because they weren't really using that much artillery, nowhere near that much. And of course, you know, ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria, along with the moderate beheaders and the Kurds, they didn't have air forces. Well, besides the American Air Force and the French Air Force, but they didn't have that, and so it was similar in that regard, right? It was basically taking care of terrorist insurgents, and the war really did revolve around winning hearts and minds, or you know giving people who were never going to go along with Assad the chance to leave the country with their lives. So you're right. I think it was probably also one of the reasons why, like, I doubted last year that we would go into a major war. Now, the main reason for me was I already saw in April 2021 what was developing in November 2021. So I didn't see any reason um, for an invasion. However, when the Ukrainians started bombing Donetsk City again, uh, I saw that there was a difference because back in April 2021, the Ukrainians had used those Bayraktar drones, and I recall they took out two artillery pieces belonging to the Donbass rebels, and I thought, like, maybe, I didn't know. I thought, like, maybe this is an omen. And of course the Russians amassed their military there. The Ukrainians stopped. Putin met with Biden in Vienna, and that was that. And then started to happen all over again. And the one thing that happened right in between Vienna and the cessation of hostilities in the spring of 2021 and the new amassing of Russian troops on the border of northern Ukraine was, of course, the fall of Kabul. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons why the war didn't set off the way it did, I think there were many that wanted the war to begin in April 2021, was Afghanistan was not finished business. And most people got Afghanistan all wrong, or what would happen to Afghanistan later, and so on and so forth. There are literally less people who they, of course, they still suffer from terrorist attacks, and 2022 was not a great year for Afghanistan. But by and large, there's fewer people who are getting killed in Afghanistan than when the Americans were there. Um, so that hopefully that's something that persuades them to find some kind of common ground.
I would also say one of the other factors that played a large part in leading to this war was that just over, you could say about 5, 6 weeks before outright conflict broke out between the Russian and Ukrainian state, there was an attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan in January of 2022. And that was, once again, around the same time as the Putin Biden meeting in Vienna. But you had a very swift Russian response to the attempted coup in Kazakhstan, in which
Hmm.
case I do think that, in large part, made them realize there's simply no negotiating their way out of this, whether that be with Ukraine or with any other front, that it is going to have to be taken to arms because even amid this diplomacy, they're trying to put another hostile regime right under our noses again. And in many ways, I think that was probably the last straw for many of the foreign policy planners in Russia who had been trying to avoid a conflict and have been trying to, or at least put off the inevitable in Ukraine. They realized that
Hmm.
if this was put off any longer, especially once the attacks were renewed on the Donbass, Donetsk city in particular, that it's a now or never moment that they can either act now, take the risk of what a war would be, what a military operation would be, or continue to be slowly pushed back as they have been for the past 15 years.
Yeah, and the other thing I can say is that Ukraine wanted this war. Ukraine wanted this war. They wanted this war that they got. They all knew that Putin would respond. That is why they resumed attacking um, Donetsk and the Donbass region, and um, just 10 months later. And so they wanted this war. No one can pretend that they didn't want this war. Um, and they got it. They got the war that they wanted. This is this is the cost. That's the cost, right? For the Americans, of course, the strategy was uh, it kind of mirrors what I was saying about Bakhmut and the way that I think that the Russians want this war to go. Um, the Americans, of course, they know that they're not going to go in and invade Russia and just take over. Those years are over, right? And nuclear weapons are the deterrent for that. So it has to happen through some kind of political process. And everybody understands now that if Russia loses the war in Ukraine, the amount of political instability that will happen will surely mean the end of Putin and probably the end of a kind of a patriotic uh, Russian government. It would become a vassal. So
It would have the same effect, I would have to say, that losing Kosovo did on the Serbs.
right. So that's what it would boil down to, right? And that's a really good point. So in other words, the American strategy at the begin in their planning for this war, of course, was We're going to sap their energy, and the Russians will not be able to tolerate it, and they'll oust Putin. And then it's just going to be a domino effect. Might take a year, but like we'll get what we want. And the Russians are doing the same by trying to sap out Ukrainian energy by basically taking out as many men as possible. And the country's impoverished, right? And these territories that it's losing, like many of them are so destroyed, like they're not going to have the money to rebuild it. But for the Ukrainian point of view, it's like, no, the territory, the territory. We want all the territory, and we just want to get rid of the Russians who live here. Because like if you watched Ukrainian TV, they would talk about how to get rid of 1.5 million Russians in the Donbass area because without damaging the industrial infrastructure. Right? That was that was like one of their intellectual discussions that they would have on their talk shows. So um so they use they got the war that they wanted, and they each side, and I mean the Americans and the Ukrainians, they have different goals, they have different reasons, but they do run parallel that they will, Russia will be out of Ukraine at the end of it if the war goes correctly. And of course, the war didn't go correctly. That is one of the reasons I think why Ukraine wanted this war, and why America wanted this war. Um, for the Ukrainians, it's this unbelievable faith in the power of America, right? Um, and for the Americans, it's their own self belief. But what they have now is a world that's very divided. Um, that is not siding with them, despite the amount of pressure that they're exerting on, say, Africa or South America. It's really not translating. And you have new countries almost on a weekly basis saying that they've signed a new deal. They're not going to be using the American dollar anymore. Uh, Remember how what a struggle Pakistan was? Well, Pakistan is not playing ball with the Americans anymore, and even though they almost assassinated Khan, that's still going through. I got to give props to that guy. And so what I'm saying is it's only accelerating America and Europe's isolation right now.
And I also have to say once again on that point, I know I've touched on this before, but a lot of people counter that by saying, well, oh, great, Russia's won over a bunch of these worthless third world nations. And I will repeat once again for anyone out there who would love to take this kind of thing out of context or love not to have any nuance on the situations. Obviously, a country like Saudi Arabia or uh, Indonesia or Brazil or whatever, obviously they don't have the high or average IQ that you might get out of Europe or most of the developed world or whatever else. But the important thing you have to understand is these countries are very strategically valuable, both in terms of geography and
Mhm.
resources. It doesn't matter whether or not they're second world, third world, whether or not it is developed as, say, Europe or the United States or whatever. But point being is, when you have countries that are the secondary powers in the world, think Russia, China, with the strategic position and strategic resources of those countries coalescing around them, that is an extremely invaluable situation to be around. I mean, the Western world, when it dominated the globe for 500 years, understood this. Nobody thought that it was
Yeah,
the
nobody said,
yeah
"Oh, just third world. Who
yeah
cares?"
yeah nobody thought of their African or Latin American or Asian colonies that the people were what's making them great, and they realized the importance of the strategic seaports, the resources, and everything else that comes along with running a global empire, as it were.
Right.
And again, it's such a lazy way.
It's the Bakhmut argument. Oh, who would want this Bakhmut or that Bakhmut? It's just third world Bakhmut, right? So okay, so why is Blinken and Biden going hat in hand to Saudi Arabia? Like if it's unimportant, okay, don't go there. But they went twice in 1 year to convince them not to side with China, and now they have an oil deal with them, and they're going to do their transactions not using the American dollar.
And it makes it even worse when you consider the West has been sitting on top of this. I don't know. Let's say like decolonization was over and done with a few holdouts. Decolonization in any significance was done with by like 1970s. Let's just say that for a fair figure. I know that's not like exactly what it was, but just for the sake of argument. And the entire time, barring France, and even that is a big asterisk on that, none of these countries took the time to actually develop their former colonies. And once again, I'm not saying that it should have been out of the kindness of their hearts, but just for pure strategic self interest, not any of them took the time to invest in the resources there to bring them home. Whereas Russia, China, love them or hate them, the money that they send overseas, by and large, not all of it, of course, by and large, has some sort of return on investment. Can you say that about American foreign aid? Can you say that about any foreign aid coming out of any European country? The point being is like, yeah, okay, maybe at face value you wouldn't expect much from this, but when you have China opening up lithium mines all across Africa, that adds up.
Yeah. There was another country just recently that signed a deal to provide. Oh, Iraq. Iraq signed a deal to sell oil to China in yuan. Iraq, of all countries. Don't they have an American base there? So it's hilarious.
Well,
What
yeah,
is like what are they going to do about Europe? What are they going to do about Europe? Like Europe is not going to be economically self-sufficient now. What are you going to do about it? Who's going to pay for it? What, you're
well,
just going to let it like are you going to let Europe turn into Ukraine without a war? Are you going to let it go to those poverty levels?
I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. Don't get me wrong. And look, I will say it
Because
once
Europe
again.
doesn't have the resources that it needs and America would not want it to be economically a contender.
I've said it in the past. I'll say it again. Post-colonial Europe is completely inviable, or unviable, I should say, as any significant global force without at least a economic partnership with Russia. And you could also argue that along those lines, perhaps it needs to be a deeper relationship. But what I'm ultimately getting at is that without a strategic partnership with Russia, Europe is completely at the mercy of the American empire, and there's no way forward for them to remain viable in a post-colonial world without access to Russian energy. In which case, again, this is the block that was developing in the early 2000s that was very quickly shut down when you had uh, Schroeder in Germany the first time, and you had Putin and whoever the president of France was. His name escapes me at this time, but they were developing a viable economic and political bloc. Maybe not so much political, but a viable economic bloc to once again really create funny that dream situation that Germany had been trying to accomplish for generations at that point of a Russia and a Germany that are very cooperative with each other, Russian resources and geography playing into the industrial capacity and the engineering prowess of a nation like Germany and as well as other places in Western Europe. But that slowly but surely was whittled away. You could argue that a large part of the expansion of NATO and the Maidan and the color revolution in Georgia was to start to create that rift between Europe proper and Russia. And you could really say, despite all of our interventions in the Middle East, despite the so called pivot to Asia, the primary foreign policy goal outside of service to the Zionists has been trying to push Russia further apart from Europe since the 2000s.
Yeah, because for them, it's a horrible scenario. They don't want um, an economically successful, viable German state. Um, They are really afraid of, you know, just the level of talent in Germany, and uh, they don't they don't want that to arise again. And I don't mean to say this euphemistically, that like the rise of Nazism, uh, would not occur again, and the reason for it is because post World War One Germany is very different. Uh, Part of the reason Germany went that route is the way it was treated after World War One. So, and the reason for World War One is the same reason that the Nord Stream pipelines had to be blown up. It's the same reason, right? Um, so they know just how dominant and capable they will be. And again, I don't mean dominant euphemistically here. Um, uh, the Germans have earned it. They have produced their own giants in music and philosophy and in science. It's not up for debate. Um, so uh, that's what they were basically afraid of. Uh, and now, like, someone will have to take care of them, because, of course, the oil and gas that they're going to get from other sources right now, even the because the Russians, I mean, the Indians are not going to sell it to them without a profit, right? The Germans could sell Russian gas for a profit to other places in Europe. That's how cheap it was. And then there's the latest news out of Bloomberg that I read today, which is um, China has been paying $85 a barrel for Russian oil. Remember how everybody said that China's gonna gouge Russia? They're gonna turn them into a colony. I mean, 85 is kind of like on par with everybody else. It's even a little more compared to some other countries that are buying Russian oil, right? That's really significant, because Russia is either the second or third largest exporter to China for oil. Um, so no, there's a lot more cooperation going on.
Well, do you want to hear a kicker of a story when it comes to energy sanctions that'll touch on some European news? So,
Hmm.
according to Bloomberg, millions of barrels of Russian crude oil and fuels have been switched between tankers just a few miles off the coast of Greece, one of the series of workarounds that traders have used to overcome EU sanctions against Russia. So, while you do have the, let's just say, energy brokers such as Turkey, Egypt, India, etc., selling back this oil at a markup price to Europe, you also just have traders who go out in international waters, take the goods, and bring them back. Now, I actually am not sure
Yep.
how transfer payment works with that in regard to the sanctions. I imagine they have some way, but even after that, Russia is just. I mean, more or less, it's just oil smuggling at this point. And I don't blame the Europeans, and they need it. It's not like I'm not gonna sit here and wag my finger at them. Hell, I don't even think these sanctions should be in place in the first place. But it just shows how clownish this all
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
It just down to its core that we can't buy the Russian oil, but we're going to participate in international smuggling in order to get it in by using international. It's completely clownish, and the question is, how common of an incident is this? If it's just a few off things, will it become more common as the situation deteriorates? And also, the other big question is how many of these tankers are going to be seized by the very sizable American fleet already in the Mediterranean or just around the North Atlantic in general? Because, once again, the
Hmm.
American naval presence is massive there, which also does go to bolster one of my developing theories that in the near future, the American Navy will likely have no choice but to turn to outright piracy in order to
Yep.
stifle these sort of arrangements. And I think that's something that's becoming sooner rather than later. I originally came up with this idea. Well, of course, I'm not the sole progenitor of it. Other people have said it. You've said it. But I originally started to, I should say, subscribe to this idea sometime around 2020 as the supply chain shortages really started to come into effect, and that we really saw the fragility of the global economy. That after a certain point, the American Navy is probably going to take to much more heavy-handed means. So, at what point, because I think it is an inevitability, do they eschew the at least official title of guarantors of the free seas and just become once again a pirate organization?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, America is not going to be hit as hard. They are not being hit as hard as Europe is. They're the least scathed out of this conflict. Um, Ukraine is hurt the most, then Europe, arguably, then Russia. Um, the rest of the world, particularly, developing nations, some of them I mean, is India a developing nation? Well, certain large chunks are, but they're making hand over fist.
I mean, in terms of
And
standard of living, it is developing, but once again, in terms of actual economic size, when it comes to GDP, as much stock as you want to put into that, it
mm,
is a very healthy economy.
yes, and so yeah, um, yeah, I concur with everything that you said. So America's going to be least scathed. I don't know what the off ramp is. Obviously, the other thing that we learned from Biden's visit to Kiev and Warsaw is this war is really, really, really important to him. And his wife reiterated yesterday that he's going to run. He's definitely going to run, and he can run and he will run. Um, so there's no turning back, and I don't know. I don't know if there is a way of turning this back. The, like the cost to America to quit now would be just enormous. Zelensky did mention that no one would respect NATO or America after that. He's not wrong.
Yeah, completely correct, but it does create the question. I mean, look, I would love to see NATO dissolved. Don't get me wrong, but it does create the question: how far are they willing to go to preserve NATO, or more appropriately, preserve American hegemony over the continent? And I think they will go pretty far. I think they'll go as far as they have the capability of. I mean, I think the only two reasons we haven't gotten directly involved in this war is because we don't have the manpower or resources for it, and the potential of it turning nuclear very fast. I think those are probably the main two factors keeping the U.S. out of any more direct involvement in this, but they're going to throw everything that they possibly can at this. I mean, that's the reason why we've seen the absolute economic chaos over the past year in the United States as well as other parts of the world. But they are willing to throw everything to the wind. But funny enough, I was actually just having this conversation with somebody else trying to really give them the, I guess what you could say, true story behind the war. Somebody who doesn't really keep up the media but is skeptical nonetheless. That one of Obama's crowning achievements in 2014, again, the last half of his second term, was the energy boom, was the shale oil boom, and and the boom in natural gas. And I remember I found some interview with some Obama administration officials saying, because this was like a few months after the annexation of Crimea, that this is actually really good that the U.S. is having such a renaissance in its energy industry because the oil and gas prices being down harms the Russian economy. And given the situation with their annexation of Crimea, the Russian economy needs to feel the consequence. That again, whatever weasel words he used in terms of him being his foreign policy economic advisor to Obama, whatever he was. But mind you, the first thing Biden did when he came into office was nix the Keystone Pipeline, and his first year was defined by him refusing to renew drilling permits across the U.S. So it is this strange doublethink where they want to throw everything they can at Russia, but they're going to themselves keep the energy price artificially high because of Biden's energy policy. And it does make you wonder, like, how much domestic clout does that actually have? How much of the quote unquote green vote does he actually have to keep in his pocket when it comes to energy production? Because I figured at this point they would have capitulated and they would have realized the damage or the potential damage that a more balanced energy market could have on Russian economic prospects is worth the backlash from the green environmentalist types. And I know a large part of the green movement is kneecapping European energy and industry, but you figure, at least in the States, at least when it comes to that, they would have the strategic mind to at least accept it on a pragmatic level that in order to have any hope of the Russian economy feeling any sort of retraction or any sort of real pain, that there needs to be a strong American energy industry. So I do wonder, is that in the cards? Has the ship sailed on that? Because once again, it seems like
Mm.
they're willing to throw literally everything else they can at that, unless, and this is also a possibility, in which case I think it reflects just as poorly, if not poorly, has American energy infrastructure degraded to the point where we can't maintain the energy boom of 2014?
Yes. Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, there's a lot of things about this that, no power can just be about power. It always has to include ideology. And I think in some ways, when you look at the rhetoric that all the Europeans are using, like Russia must lose. We cannot afford Ukraine to lose. Like, uh, Putin has to go to the Hague. All of this stuff that you cannot
Hague.
walk back, right? You
Yeah,
can't walk it back. And in the same way, the Green New Deal, all of this stuff is stuff he can't walk back. They've over invested in it. And I mean, it would have been a hell of a lot easier, as you point out, for him to walk this back. Um, for the pipelines, for the Keystone pipeline. But he refused to. And I mean, I mean, I don't know how in charge he is, or I mean, he obviously has signs of senility. I don't know how committed his inner circle is to him and his so-called vision, or let's say the vision that he's adopted as his own. Because I mean, he's very fluid. I mean, he has said stuff that, like, you know 25 years ago, that doesn't match up with anything that he's saying now. Um, I'm not going to get into the whole minutia of examples, but you can find them. Um, Gay marriage just being one of them. So um, he could have walked this back, but he didn't. And when you look at his speeches, like when he was in Kiev and then in Warsaw, he does this angry thing. He does this. He's and he did it at the State of the Union address. It's, I mean, he's not stable.
No, and he never particularly has been, but especially with age and what we can only assume is mental and cognitive decline, it has only gotten magnitudes worse.
Hmm. Yeah.
But with that being said, before I return to some of the European news, just to go over some points from Putin's speech, which was around the same time as the Biden speech, competing for ratings, I suppose, there were quite a few things that he did cover. He went into a lot of the rhetoric he's been doing, and it's the less important part of the speech, so I'll start with that. A lot of the rhetoric he's been doing about calling out the Western ideology, for example, just a few quotes here. The West propose a gender neutral God, forgive them, Lord. They know not what they're doing. We must protect our children from degradation to generation, and we will do it. The family is always a union of man and woman, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of the very, I guess, say traditional conservative talking points that you would expect did come out. But in terms of the actual meat of it, the steak versus the sizzle, some things that we had referenced earlier when it came to especially the soldiers and the economic situation. The minimum wage is supposed to increase about 18.5%. Families with two or more children are exempt from taxes on the sale of housing. Funds for a national project, which are reserved for 2024, will be released for use now. And when it came to the broader geopolitical questions, cautioning against renewing ties with Europe economically, becoming a more self sufficient nation, withdrawing from the START 3 treaty, it was suspended as a result of the speech, and saying that Ukraine can never be allowed again to be a threat to Russian territory, and potential expansion of the to get the exact quote here, quote, Ukrainian forces will have to be further pushed away from the Russian border, which would imply an extended military operation and more troops. And then he had also said on the de-dollarization of the world, Russian GDP in 2022 decreased only by 2.1%. Estimates at the opposite side did not become reality when they said a decline of 15% or 20%. We're building a new international system independent of the USD together with our partners. So he touched on all the main points, but I think the main one was probably the de-dollarization talk and the withdrawal from the START 3 treaty that was agreed to in it was negotiated and ratified between 2010 and 2012. And that was the most recent arms limitation that they had pulled that Russia just pulled out of. And that's on top of Trump having pulled out of the other actually several arms treaties during his tenure in office.
Mm.
So this is actually the really the first response in kind we've gotten to that, and that was about 4 years ago when you had Trump suspending and withdrawing from a lot of the treaties. Yeah, you had the one missile treaty. I can't remember the exact name. The intermediate, uh, yeah, the intermediate like nuclear treaty, something along those lines. Then I think they actually did end up pulling out of open skies as well, which had to do with European airspace and notification of crossing airspaces and coming close to airspaces. But this is the first time we've really seen Russia take the initiative and start to suspend these treaties, which I do think is an interesting escalation. People were talking about this. I do have to give credit to one Twitter account in particular who has done fantastic coverage of this war and the surrounding events. I couldn't recommend it enough. I believe his at is Stalin Frog, all one word, Stalin, like Joseph Stalin, and Frog, like the animal. Um, Great stuff when it comes to keeping up this war. I'm not sure if it's a public account, so you might have to request to follow it if you even bother with the Twitter thing in the first place. Which, if you don't, I don't blame you at all. But if you do, it's certainly a worthwhile feed of news and commentary, I would say. But there was discussion around that about how potentially this war could have been a much less, let's just say, extensive affair if Russia had flexed its nuclear muscles moving into this and even before this, if it showed that, yes, it is still a nuclear power that has the capability and means to use these weapons if need be. Although there's a bit of a dynamic. Somebody, another user, I know I'm quoting a Twitter debate here, but I do think it shed some light on something interesting that I had not considered before. While I did think that was a valid point about perhaps maybe Russia should have been a bit more belligerent with the nuclear deterrence, that the leadership in the West is fundamentally less rational than it was at any point during the Cold War, to the point where that is a very dangerous escalation to take. So I think at this point, there really is no choice but to say that nukes are something that we do have in our arsenal, and these are the circumstances in which we can use them under to defend our nation and our allies, etc., etc. And all of this actually led to fears being voiced out of France by the administration there, Macron and his people, about a return to nuclear testing. Now, Macron, throughout this entire war, even before this war, has always played that, I guess you could say, devil's advocate role, where he's the one they send to talk to Putin. He's the one that isn't just completely outright hostile to Putin. And he said that if Russia does this, he does fear that the U.S., followed by Russia, will return to nuclear testing. Which, although, once again, I know the score about Macron, I think he expresses a very valid point that is probably a concern of the entire European continent, that they could be wedged in the middle of another arms race. And I do think that's a real possibility going forward into the future, because at this point, once again, you have a United States and NATO that, at least as far as this time period is concerned, who knows, it could escalate further, has no interest in getting directly boots on the ground involved in this war in any significant manner beyond sending a few mercs and, of course, the endless supply of money and weapons. But if this does continue, the only thing I can think of is it's going to have to be another nuclear arms race in order for the powers to stand off against each other. And mind you, Russia has, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even after all the upheaval, has always took very proactive measures in keeping its arsenal modernized. Whereas the U.S., and even Trump said this in his last State of the Union, that the U.S. nuclear arsenal has been neglected for 30 years, since the end of the Cold War at this point. So when it comes to an arm race, not even talking about the use of these arms, but an arms race, you already have Russia with a head start, which once again also makes that dangerous, because once Russia has the head start, you start to get the underground testing, then you get the above ground testing, and at what point does it get brazen enough for somebody to just fire one off, and then things certainly spiral out of control from there. One of the things we had speculated back in 2019 on the show is that it is not out of the realm of possibility for the U.S. to use low yield nukes in order to express its power if it's ever pushed into a position where its power is rapidly waning. Now, you could argue that's now. I wouldn't quite argue that's now, because I do think that the pillaging of Europe has buoyed up the U.S. and the American empire for at least a few years at this point. Now, once that starts to wear off, we'll see how it stands now. But these are very real questions that we, and I would say everyone with an interest in staying alive, will have to think about in the near future.
Yeah, very much so. And Macron is one of those guys. He's very clever. Like, he is obviously above average IQ. But the things I've always found funny about him is, like, he loves the plot twist. you know, I think there's sometimes that he runs like an errant boy business for America. He's there to semi comfort Putin and beguile him somehow to arrive at a position in a way that the Biden administration on its own cannot. Um, but then he has his own plot twist. He's very ambitious, because like, let's recall that 2019, 2020, we talked about it, and at that point, and you can understand America's moves from a purely valueless judgment. You can understand even why America blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Merkel and him wanted, an EU army, which inevitably means America is out of Europe. And that is why Europe is being punished. Uh, and why it can never be allowed to ever have independence again. America will not tolerate it. And notice that as soon as Merkel left, what was it, in late September 2021?
Yes.
And Schultz has this, he has this minority government, and he has to share it with the Greens and even some of his members like Baerbock. And we talked about the interview that Annalena Baerbock gave with Blinken. on it was either CSIS or the Atlantic Council, and I told you about it, and it was like,
A
my God,
coalition so incoherent that if you removed Germany from the equation, you'd think we were talking about Spain or Italy, just to put it in perspective.
yeah, and you knew that this is the one. This is the one that like the Biden administration is really pushing for. So in many ways, pulling out of Afghanistan, Merkel out of office are the two things that allowed the U.S. to be able to bully um, Germany into this position. Because remember, they can America's first and foremost what it has to do, even over and above Ukraine for its own sake, is to stop any kind of independence of Europe. And Britain is just as interested in that as America is. Um, and of course, what did Macron do? Macron switched sides. It took him a while. I mean, all of these leaders initially, before the war started, and just as it started, they still had to be dragged along. Of course, as we know now, um, partly because they've divulged it themselves, partly because of Seymour Hersh and his subsequent articles and his subsequent interviews that he's done. We know that we're already planning the sanctions in December because then they knew the war would kick off. Ukraine was ready for this war. Remember, Ukraine wanted this war, and Ukraine got this war. Um, so Macron, again, plot twist. He keeps some of his sort of diplomatic charm, but now he's using it for Biden. He will just I think deep down inside he wants to have a more powerful position, and he has been willing to play against the U.S. in order to achieve that. And we've discussed on the show that the way they did it before, it was, oh, they were just objecting to Trump. But you don't set up an EU army just because you don't like Trump. Trump isn't going to become a dictator. Now, that's what they implied for 2 years, and when he was out, they ran out of the narrative road, as it were, to use mixed metaphors. But they couldn't use that anymore, and it was done. And but Macron is he fascinates me, but not in the way that he fascinates Richard Spencer.
Oh no, yeah, that's a yeah. Macron. It is funny because you did have that stretch there in 2019, 2020, where he was very contrary to American interest, at least in terms
Yeah,
of his rhetoric. The one that really sticks out in my mind is summer 2020. You have the Libya crisis, which looks like it's going to boil over again. You have a cooperation between Russia and France on the side of Haftar's government trying to stonewall Turkey from expanding this energy project to the rival faction in Libya. To the point where you had French warships posturing against
yeah,
Turkey in the
yeah,
Mediterranean in 2018, 2019, when you had the buildup of migrants that was potentially going to be released to France, to Bulgaria and Greece and into the rest of Europe. Once again, France sent warships into those waters. That was early 2020. But you had in that year and a half period, pretty much from 2019 up until Trump lost the election and Biden took office, Macron's administration in France was taking a very renegade line, and
yep.
I'll admit, it actually impressed me for quite a while. And I never gave him too much credit, but I said that
Yeah, because we were doing the base Macron, ironically, but we were doing, not always.
not always, but I remember in 2020, pretty much up until Trump lost the election. Well, actually, I should backtrack. Up until the attempted regime change in Belarus is when he started to lose me again. But
Yeah,
for that year and a half period there, it looked like if maybe not him, maybe he's laying the groundwork. For example, when somebody more competent comes to power in France, in order for a more independent power bloc to arise out of that, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, etc., etc., etc. But that has been completely dashed. I mean, and depending on how the war in Ukraine goes, and depending on how all this goes, perhaps there will be potential for that again. But I do think that was a large part of determining U.S. policy towards Europe under the Biden administration was that brief period of rebellion that you did see out of Paris out of Paris in the literal sense when it came to the
Hmm.
Yellow Vest, and out of Paris in the more figurative sense when you saw their moves. Funny enough, actually post Yellow Vest when they became a more independent power, as it were. I think they possibly feared, maybe not anytime soon, but later down the road, of another French withdrawal from NATO or something along those lines, and they feared that that would have ripple effects. I don't have the maps now; they're on my old computer, and I just switched computers. But you'll recall one of the images I would always bring up 2019, 2020 was that projection of how European Union countries would respond to a Trump administration versus a non Trump administration in terms of how they plan on forging ties with China versus the US. And once again, the Trump map was almost entirely pink and purple, implying that they wanted to seek partners in China and elsewhere. And you had very few nations, aside from some of the Eastern European rabid chihuahuas, who actually wanted to increase ties with the U.S. under the Trump administration, but almost all of them were light or dark blue under a non-Trump administration. Once again, showing the
Yeah.
incoherence of Europeans, especially when it comes to the question of their independence and their policy being dictated by the U.S. They seemingly have that complaint, understandably so. I will give them that. But every time they have the opportunity to really break that leash, they fall back in line, and then they're infatuated with the next Democratic administration that comes into office. You saw this with Bush, you saw this with Trump, with Obama and Biden replacing them respectively. That although there is those sentiments there, the European political class is far too neutered to ever follow through on something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the incoherency is this. Part of it is the Poland and the Chihuahua countries despise Russia and see they don't see a future for themselves as long as Russia exists, even if Russia does nothing. And this is particularly true with Ukraine, especially on a cultural level, that Russia just has to exist, and they will always feel threatened. Um, um, their culture will always be diminutive in comparison to Russia's, and they have historical grudges and so on and so forth. But I think that there's another reason why there's an incoherency, and I think that has to deal with various plans and policies. So when you look at Merkel and you look at Macron and what they wanted to achieve, there is a point where their plan, if they have a plan, okay, if they had a plan, and they want to have a regime change in Belarus, that's in some respects going along with the general policy towards Russia. Okay. Uh, but the way an American would look at that is, well, we're going to go to war with Russia, and we need Belarus to effectively go to war with Russia in Ukraine because Ukraine is ready for the war now. Ukraine wants the war, and we want the war. I think what the mature or the older European countries, excluding Britain, of course, what they wanted was a plan that would isolate Russia by playing nice with China. Ironically, Western Europe had a plan, putting everything else aside, that was more like Trump than anyone else. Also, never forget that no matter how much they liked Obama, and this is really where they could have figured out what the American plan was. Never forget that this is Obama's war. Ukraine is Obama's war. It is Obama's decision. You can blame it on the think tanks. You can blame it on members of his presidency, but it's still him. He made the choice.
Yeah, he was the one who put all those factors in place. He was the one who brought
Yeah,
Newland into the State Department. He was the one who,
Newland, Hyatt,
yeah,
Kagan,
and
all those guys.
like I said, although you can once again get down to brass tacks and look at them and say, yeah, they're responsible. Ultimately, it funnels up, and it was all part of his apparatus, even if he was just signing on something that was thrown on his desk. Point
Yeah,
being
I mean, he
is,
made the China
yeah,
pivot, right? Like, that's the reason he did that, right? All of this, he really was the black sheep the whole time. Um, he's he was never noticed because of course he was the America's first black president, and all the issues surrounding him had to deal with the emerging culture war in America, and all the policies that he put in place that exacerbated that, in some cases ignited it in the first place. But I think the vision that Macron, and I would dare say even Hollande had, along with Merkel, was, listen, Americans, we're going to isolate Russia more effectively. We're going to do it more slowly. Um, China is pragmatic. China, we'll work with you with China. You remember Macron losing it when the submarine deal with Australia fell apart. Um, but they had their plan, and it was a more subtle and long range plan about how they were going to do this. But it required Europe getting becoming more prosperous and mature, and countries like Poland and the Baltic states would just have to suck it up.
I would also include in that, although it's outside of Europe, about countries that also have to suck it up, would be Israel as well. And I think that's a
Yes,
large part of what allowed Trump to be propelled into office is that a lot of the people who are primarily Zionists and then supporters of the American empire versus the other way around wanted somebody who would be more unabashedly Zionistic in their foreign policy, even at the expense of other imperial projects.
yeah, yeah. So I think that is what happened when they're like, when Merkel or Hollande say he, we were never going to agree to Minsk to, um they omit like the part where, like, are you kidding? If I ever said this, I'd never get Nord Stream 2 constructed. Like, they're not being totally honest with you. They're trying to say that they knew the plan. If they knew it, they went against it. But those decisions were just policy decisions. Okay. The pressure against Russia via Ukraine was always supposed to be there, right? I just think that they felt like maybe Syria was enough. Maybe like the Russian economy would have just eventually stagnate, and China would begin to move away from Russia. Because let's not kid ourselves. China has moved more closely to Russia. That is true, but China was hesitant. China's doing a lot more now than ever before, and we'll get to the statements. Well, I guess I could say them now. China's recent statements that they're going to work with the Russians militarily, that the foundation of the relationship is rock solid. That peace plan, which is just suggestions, like, I mean, they're not serious. Everybody knows that, and even if they were, and it was a decent peace plan, even if it was 90% of what Biden would have wanted, Biden has to say no because it's China. Um, but putting that aside, China was not closer to Russia 5, 6 years ago, and you could see why the Europeans felt that this is something that they could control, that they could manage this, and that they used the excuse that with Trump they felt unsafe, and that's why they had to create an EU. That's not why. That's not why. It's
No,
because they wanted independence.
yeah, convenient out, but since we've brought up Trump so much and the dynamic of U.S. presidents in relation to Europe, Trump actually had a very interesting small address on the topic of the Ukraine war and some of the outcomes of that. Now, he once again implicated the Obama administration, Victoria Nuland, and all that for being the ones who set this war into motion, for being the ones who intervened in Ukraine, creating the situation. So that was surprising enough. I mean, there had been times during Trump's campaign, even during his presidency, when he would have those actually very coherent criticisms of the American empire.
Mhm.
And it is strange because I have spent, what, the past year or so on this program in particular, bashing the idea of a Trump 2024 run and that Trump 2.0 is probably going to be completely compromised. And while I don't entirely go back on that, I still believe that is a significant possibility. What I see here did make me question that, even if just ever so slightly. So he put out that video, and then one particular quote from it was regarding the demolition of the Nord Stream pipelines. Yes, it could have
Mm.
been us, it could have been Ukraine, or it could have been some third country looking for trouble. These people are sick, trust me, Ukraine has now total influence over the United States, complete dominance. Now, of course, the framing of that is rather Trumpian, where it's
For America.
yeah, it's clearly Kiev isn't calling the shots in Washington.
It
It's
reminds me of that tweet from a few years ago. I'm afraid of America finding life in outer space because if we did, we'd give them money.
oh yeah, yeah. We'd
No
immediately
one is more America first than this dude.
yeah, and yeah, and that's interesting because then you have his tweets that were very critical of Syria around the time the proposed 2013 intervention. But for somebody I had counted as completely compromised, and like I said, I'm not completely sold on Trump again.
Yeah.
Do have and I think we all do. I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't all say we had ever so slightly the underlying pro-Trump sympathies that are still residually within all of us.
Yes.
But that statement did surprise me. Now, I don't think there would be any actual substantial follow through under a Trump 2.0 presidency to actually rectify any of that or even address it in any official capacity. But it does make me think that he is, once again, ever so slightly off the reservation. Although I know the idea of supporting Ukraine is souring on a lot of Americans, not quite to that level, to the point where you name drop Victoria Nuland. And you know who else name dropped Victoria Nuland this week?
Mm.
Elon Musk.
Oh, yes, I saw that tweet.
So I do think what you do have developing is not exactly a counter elite in the American political realm, in just the realm of power, whether that be business, politics, whatever, but a more off the reservation elite, people who are still tied to the powers that be, but want some sort of, I guess you could call them reformists. People like Musk, people like Trump. And once again, I have quite a bit of positive and negative to say about both those men in particular and the cohorts that surround them. But I do think that they will be given more leeway as America finds itself in more of a crisis, as reformist, as somebody they can either put up there to hopefully take a lot of the blame for what goes wrong because their reforms quote unquote failed, or capitalize on their reforms while casting them aside. So I do think that they are letting them, and I think they've been doing this for 2016 since Trump, letting them wander ever so slightly off the reservation so then they can either capitalize on the successes or the failures of that.
Yes, good point. Um, yeah, I don't know what to add to that.
Well, with that, we can get into Biden's little tour to Kiev and Warsaw. So,
Do we have do we have a siren soundtrack?
I I wish I was that technologically literate, but we are operating with, let's just say, very limited technological capacity. Perhaps one day, when the war report is a full and proper operation, we can get to that. But I only wish so. Just imagine. But there was the beautiful little shot of him arriving in Kiev, hugging Zelensky, and during his two addresses in both Warsaw and Kiev, particularly the topic of standing up to Russia came up, and of course it did, and guaranteeing the security of these nations. One thing that stuck out to me as particularly interesting is that he had made some interesting pledges to Poland in regard to the energy sector, where he made the commitment of building nuclear power plants in Poland while his administration is doing nothing for the upkeep and further construction of any sort of nuclear energy within the U.S. And keep in mind that's on top of another 100 billion to Ukraine and everything else we've poured into that. But Biden, once again, it seemed like a lot like with the State of the Union, he tried to take a page out of Trump's book by flying into Poland and giving this great defender of Western civilization speech, in which case he face planted on his way back into his airplane again, as does tend to happen a lot if you haven't noticed. And I would say probably the more important event of all of that was concurrent and arguably had been influenced by Biden's arrival and just the political situation with Biden coming to Eastern Europe and reaffirming U.S. support there in general. Is the situation currently developing in Moldova with Transnistria or Pridnestrovia, whichever you may prefer? Brief history, we've discussed it before. It is a sliver of land in eastern Moldova that, during the time of the Soviet Union, and in fact still now, was populated by a large amount of ethnic Russians because the way Moldova was taken into the Soviet Union during the 1940s, and of course with the ethnic gerrymandering of the Soviet Union, that led to a sizable ethnic Russian and even small amounts of Ukrainian population right there, as opposed to the predominantly Romanian population of Moldova. Upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a hotspot. There was armed conflict in Transnistria and in Moldova in the early 90s. A peace was brokered, in which case roughly 1,000 Russian troops and military equipment were allowed to stay there as a peacekeeping contingent. And the situation there has been quiet ever since. The quote unquote country of Moldova has no official diplomatic recognition even from Russia, so they are completely on their own there, but still maintain a functional state. And funny enough, it it's the Nazbol country if you actually want to think about it, because they use a lot of the former Soviet aesthetics. They have like the Moldovan Soviet Republic flag. But then you look at a lot of the postcards and the propaganda they put out. They like call themselves the last holdout of the Russian Empire, and you find like all this like imperial symbolism there. Um, you have a lot of the aspects of like traditional Russian culture and even like a very privileged position of the Orthodox Church in society. And once again, like it really is just like a sliver of the Russian Empire existing in the 21st century that uses communist aesthetics. Pretty much, it, like I said, it is probably the ideal Nazbol society if I had to put words to it. But this memeability aside, it has been a topic of a large amount of speculations since 2014, especially since 2022, since the outbreak of the war. There were several times at the beginning of the war, and you, in fact, still have Ukrainian troops, and they've only grown in size, amassed on the Moldovan border in preparation to attack this territory. And with the direction of the Moldova government, which was installed by Color Revolution, I believe, in 2018, 2019, with Sandu's government. Now, Sandu has resigned, but there's still the situation of the caretaker government, and that's just the side of the parliament, and that's not even getting into the question of the president of Moldova. But you have them, the current government in power in Moldova for the time being, is more likely to allow a Ukrainian operation into Transnistria, or there is the potential of a Moldovan operation there, because of the disparity in population alone, even with Russian forces, even with a small contingent there participating, it would be a complete wash unless Russia could immediately intervene, possibly having to expand the war into Moldova, possibly going to war with the Moldovan government, which once again is also very. I don't think they would do that, but would be a very risky prospect in general, considering the very pro-Russian sentiments that still exist among a large part of the Moldovan population. You had pro-Russia rallies in Moldova, in um, Chisinau, and throughout the country over the past several weeks. There have been people expressing support for at least ending the war in Ukraine and ending Moldovan involvement in the war in Ukraine. Moldova has always been one of those countries that has been very divided when it comes to the question of moving westward or staying more towards the Russian sphere. So a lot of people speculate that they are going to go into Transnistria, and I can only see that happening not for any strategic reason. Once again, there's only 1,000 Russian troops there. There's no real way to reinforce or supply it at this point. Completely landlocked. But it would be just another opportunity to move in and more or less, I mean, let's just be honest, ethnically cleanse the population there. And it would be a complete wash. They would, I mean, think about it. Like, they're not going to deport them back to Russia. They're not going to show that common courtesy. It is going to be a blood in the streets if the Ukrainians move into there. And I do believe that is nothing more than a reprisal attack because there is nothing strategically sound or really anything logical at all about an attack on Transnistria unless you're doing it as a reprisal against ethnic Russian diaspora.
Right. And now there is, of course, the talk about the arsenal. It's supposed to be the largest one in all of Europe. Um, what's less mentioned is how old that arsenal is and how functional it might be. But I would assume that there is a lot of it and that they wanted. But the number one reason, of course, would be to try to distract Russia. Like one of the reasons why the Ukrainians fire into Kursk region and some of the other regions into, let's say, Russia before 2022, Russia before 1991, um, is to distract the Russians. It's to draw away manpower. This is why they shell Donetsk City. They shell the civilians. Part of it is hatred. Yes, they have this unbelievable hatred that the U.S. has also helped nurture for decades and decades, and this kind of almost like ridiculous belief, like they could have they would be towering giants if it were not for Russia. Everything is Russia's fault. Um, but it is to draw the Russians away. It is to get even. It would like morally lift, especially like the ideologues within Ukraine. It would be a big bonus for them. It would be a humiliation for Russia um, if they did it. Why they haven't done it so far, I don't know, other than the retaliation, the escalation by the Russians is something that they are afraid of. Like, I know people say that Russia has no red lines and so on and so on. Well, they do and they don't. Uh, it's true that they don't react to every red line that's crossed, but when they do, it does make an impact. That's one of the reasons why this war started. And it was a red line that the Ukrainians knew that they would be countered for crossing. And the same thing goes for Crimea. Remember that it was the blowing up of the Kerch Bridge. That is what started the program of Russia just, you know, taking out and Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So there's many places now that are living without uh, water or heat. Not particularly easy in winter. It's a way to tax and sap the energy of the public. So they do have red lines, and I imagine that if they did go for Transnistria, that would be a red line for Russia. Especially if you described if the this case, and I do think that would be the case. I would agree with you. Um, that might be the only reason because everybody knows Russia can't just transport troops all the way across, and that's then Transnistria is safe. I mean, Transnistria is like it's like it's apart. It's just all north and south. It's not particularly an easy place to defend. Um, so I imagine there would be retaliation. The question is there somebody that says it's worth the retaliation? It's worth finding out.
Well, I think it's also a much more precarious situation considering the internal political situation in Moldova right now because the opposition, which is actually polling higher than the ruling party, said that they would consider any attack on Transnistria by Ukrainian forces an attack on Moldova. So there is a very unbalanced situation on there, especially with the protests, which seem to indicate at least some degree of sympathy with Russia, if not just disdain for the Ukrainian war effort at this point. That if they do go in there, even to try to secure any ammunition stockpiles, which, again, the quality of that ammunition and military supplies is highly questionable given what you had said when it comes to the age of it. But I think they risk, and especially when it comes to the concerns of Europe and the broader American empire, of driving Moldova right back into Russia once again, having just that little wedge on Ukraine's border. Not that I think Russia would move more troops in there and push in and open a new front, but point being is that could hamper supplies, that could hamper aid to Ukraine, and that's probably one of the other reasons they have been hesitant about that. And I will also add that there probably is some sort of dead man switch in place by the Russians if the Ukrainians do go in there. That's probably, I know there's 1,000 troops are officially peacekeepers, but they've had to know those coming for quite some time now, at least since 2014. That, and I would imagine they have some sort of scorched earth policy or something to make the operation either not worth it or completely backfire on Ukraine, if not from Transnistria itself, from elsewhere, as you were describing with the red lines. But even if they were to try to go in for the ammo, I can't imagine a scenario where the ammunition and the military supplies aren't just completely scuttled.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a second front, I would presume the Americans would be more interested in trying Kazakhstan again rather
Hell,
than
or even the Caucasus. I mean, out of all the potential second fronts, Transnistria seems like the least useful, so to speak.
least useful, but it's the most it's the easiest one to do.
Yes.
And in a in a fit of rage, I can see them doing it. Um, who knows? At the moment, I was talking when I was doing the minutia minute. There is a I brought up the town of Bogdanovka, and well, there's a highway that runs around that area, the O0506. Um, it feeds into the western part of Bakhmut, just south of Yagodnaya, and it's just 2-3 kilometers. That's it. If by tomorrow that road is taken, I mean, like I'm being honest. The Ukrainians are going to have to go across fields. They have one tiny road from Ivanovskoye, Chasov Yar, and that's it. So who knows if Bakhmut is tactically encircled in a very real way. Just out of spite, they might go for it as a desperate attempt. I mean, it's more short term. Like for long term planning, you would want a place like Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, for instance, now wants to sell its oil to Europe vis-a-vis Russia. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but Kazakhstan is a place that's teetering. It has a George Soros University. It's not fully there. There's stuff that the Americans can tinker with.
Well, Kazakhstan, I think the biggest driver we'll see in Kazakhstan is, yes, I'm not going to downplay the oil and gas reserves, but the uranium reserves. They produce more uranium than even Russia does. And if, and it's been a very unstable situation, if an EU sanctions package does target uranium supplies, they're that means they're going all in on Kazakhstan because I know that they aren't particularly concerned about the well-being of the European people, but they do have a bottom line. They will keep the lights just barely on. They might
Mhm.
drive all the industry out of the country. They might drive any economic prosperity out of the country, but they'll certainly keep the lights on. They'll keep it just barely first world or whatever you want to define as first world now. But I would say an indication that something is going to happen in Kazakhstan will be if a uranium ban is put into one of the sanctions package. In which case, they already tried that, but it was through the efforts of France and Hungary that the most recent sanctions package had to exclude that. So, if that ever does go through, I can almost guarantee you that Kazakhstan will be opening up as a second front.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we'll just have to see. We'll just have to see. And I think that that's also another reason why Russia is not willing to commit more than 20% of its forces there, and probably why they did the um, first mobilization with 300,000 is they know that Kazakhstan is always a potential, always a potential. So or somewhere else, or um, they have to keep a certain force in Belarus, just to counter through escalatory escalatory uh, through the use of escalation against the Poles should they try an incursion, because the Poles are like they have bought something like close to 100 HIMARS. Like each unit that fires HIMAR missiles like needs another 9 vehicles to make sure that happens correctly and effectively.
And even if it's not outright military action, just the encirclement of Kaliningrad by a Polish or NATO military force would probably be enough to warrant at least some degree of Russian response. Maybe not an outright military response, but something. Once again,
Hmm.
these situations when it comes to Article 5 territory are very hard to maneuver because there's so many directions it could go. But I mean, I believe that the Russian buildup in Belarus is for the contingency plan that Kaliningrad is actually cut
Yeah,
off. Uh,
yeah.
and once again, people speculate that was to open up a new front in Ukraine, but no, that's for anything involving the Baltic states and Poland that might get out of hand. And then you have the situation in Georgia, which seems mostly stable, but you have to recall just a few months ago when the Ukrainians were having their counteroffensives, they were in talks with the Georgians to try to reopen up both the Abkhazian and South Ossetian fronts. You have the Nagorno Karabakh war, which is an every few months flare up before it calms back down. So there's that, as we mentioned, Kazakhstan, and potentially, I can't say to this, but tensions in the Balkans with Serbia and Kosovo are the highest they've been since Kosovo declared independence. So while I don't think that would be as high as a priority for Russia to assist the Serbs, I also think at the same time they can't afford not to assist them, even if it's not a direct involvement. So that's about 3 or 4 different secondary fronts that could open up at just about any time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's mind-boggling when you think of like just how. I mean, even Burrell said, we're not going to have World War III, but the war is going to go global. Like, I think you're basically saying that we are going to have World War III.
Well, speaking of Borrell, he is planning a summit in March where he's going to meet with every European Union country to convince them to hand over all of their ammunition stockpiles to Ukraine, saying that new procurement would take too long and that they need to suffer the temporary sacrifice of turning over every bit of ammunition they have and that they can worry about replenishing later because the war in Ukraine is that vital. So that is now again negotiation always works. You always demand more than you expect to get, So I doubt Borrell thinks he's going to go to all 20 something European Union countries and expect all of them to hand over their weapon stockpiles. And in which case, you even had the UK admit that, well, yeah, that's good enough for 5 days in a full scale war. So we'll see how much, even if that lofty goal were to be accomplished, how much that would actually amount to. And that would include Poland, which has been arming itself to the teeth, which that also does create an interesting dynamic. How exactly does that work? But once again, that's taking this at face value. You read into it. It's we want you to send as much as you can, not necessarily all of it, because once it's political speak, as I'm sure you all understand. But it does look like the European Union, through Borrell, what a wonderful man, my favorite, wants to dump everything conceivably possible, similar to the U.S., wants to dump everything conceivably possible into this war in the hopes of toppling Russia because they have dug themselves in such a deep hole for the past year. I mean, it goes back before now, but I would say the point of no return was the outbreak of the Ukrainian war. They've dug themselves in such a deep hole that really, if they want to maintain NATO credibility, they have no other choice. They want to maintain European Union, American Empire credibility. They have no other choice than to throw every cent, every ammunition, every weapon they can into this war.
Yeah, yeah, it really is that bad. Um, I don't know. I don't know where we go from here.
And it is quite the subversion of what we had said at the beginning of the war. And I do believe at the beginning of war this held true that the West is fighting for a lifestyle, whereas Russia is fighting for its life. But the
Yeah.
West has put itself in a position where, at least in its current form, it is fighting for its life. It is fighting for its
Yes, it
political
didn't have to be
legitimacy.
this way. It didn't have to be this way, right? Um, but they've made it this way. They've made it a fight for its life now, especially after Nord Stream. I mean, there was even in Germany, um, some business organization talking with the government was talking because there were 8 pipelines altogether. Um, 6 were destroyed. 2 are still operable, and they're asking, well, maybe we can use them. Like they still haven't given up. And if we look at more German news, um, there was an interesting demonstration today in Berlin. 50,000 peace protesters, and what's hilarious is Bismarck's great grandson was there, and they're asking for peace, and um, they dragged some Russian tank into the center of town, and they put a Ukrainian flag and that stupid, NAFO dog, Dogo dog. Remember Dogo coin and all that nonsense.
Yeah,
So it's so
yeah,
cringe, and so they um they had that on top of the tank. And what happened was these protesters showed up with flowers, so they started putting flowers all over the tank. And you had people who wrote stuff in Serbian, um, Latin, and German. In Serbian, it was written for our Russian brothers who lost their lives in this tank. Eternal glory to you. In German, in memory of the murdered children of Donbass since 2014. In memory of the children of Ukraine killed since 2014. And in memory of the illegal coup of 2014. And then, oh, this was delicious. Sergei Sumleni, who apparently, according to Russians with Attitude, was a Putin shill not long ago. So he tweeted,
Oh, so he did the Kasparov thing.
yeah, 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 exactly. So he tweeted photos of this event, and at one point, this German fella climbed on top of the tank and uh, grabbed and threw the Ukrainian flag off the tank. And so this was hilarious. It's getting, it's getting serious. So he says the Russian Nazis brought tons of flowers for the Russian Nazi tank in order to express their solidarity with Russia's genocide of Ukrainians. Um, then he quote tweeted something by Serhiy Reznik. Um, so there was something written in Russian, um, wedged in a corner of the tank. It looks like it would have been where the wheels are, and it reads, "We pray on our knees daily for Russia's victory. Forgive us. We don't know what to do. Germany will be free from Anglo-Saxon slavery. We are mourning and crying for the fallen heroes of Russia." This infuriated them. It infuriated them. But I think, a good portion of the German population knows what's going on. I don't know what they're going to achieve, but if this is supposed to become a global war, I don't know how many Europeans are really going to go along with this. Uh,
Oh, the
it's
Europeans
going
are
to,
already at their limit without having to actually put themselves in the front lines. I mean, of course, you'll get the support from the government, so you'll get the support from a significant part of the population, but
yeah.
resentment against this war, and particularly the involvement of the American Empire, grows more and more every day. And thus far, aside from volunteer mercenaries, there has not been any blood spilled from these countries.
Hmm.
But when, or if or when, I don't even know which one to say at this point, they do decide to have a much deeper involvement, a much deeper commitment, how many young European men are going to look at this and think, this is a cause I am going to stand for? Especially, I know that's just one event you pointed out, but I do think it's a microcosm of greater sentiments. And
Right.
it's much the
Go
same
ahead. Go
problem
ahead.
as the U.S. Like, how many young white guys are they going to convince to actually stand up and get involved in this? I mean, what are they going to? Is France going to conscript all the young Algerian men, all the young Algerian refugees into the French Foreign Legion and send them over to? What's the plan here?
Yeah, better ask Abdul. Safety soon. Um, there's a Polish guy. Uh, I mean, we're not talking through like our private accounts on Telegram, but I have interacted with them. I bring this up only because you mentioned like how willing are they, and he says it's no secret. People in Poland know that about over 2,000, they're thinking 2,400, 2,500. Polish guys have made the ultimate sacrifice in Ukraine because they can see the cemeteries, they can count the graves. So uh, you know, the Germans and French are going to be far less willing to go and fight, and I would say that despite the British government um, and Britain's stance overall, beside put away their rhetoric, I don't think that they're going to be all that willing either. Um, that isn't even to bring up America, but Poland's already bleeding now. So
And I think you had just made the point there that the only place that you're actually going to convince to do this are Eastern European countries, and I would say out of all of them, Poland has the most means and the most will to do so.
yeah,
But I always return to this one anecdote, and once again, it's just that an anecdote about this Slovak guy I was talking to about the war in Ukraine. And I was talking to him, and he had a more pro-Russia bend. I'm sure that shocks you, the kind of circles I'm in, but I was talking to him. I was like, yeah, I get like, yeah, there's the history there, especially the recent history with the Soviet Union, and whatnot. But I get the impression that a lot of people in Central and Eastern Europe, although they might not like the Russians, although they might hate the Russians, they have no real love for Ukrainians and don't want to die on their behalf in the Donbass. And
Mhm.
he said, yeah, that was pretty much the case in Slovakia, and I think he had also said Hungary, but he had said a few other countries. But I've heard it from him. I've heard it from other people. But once again, outside of Poland and the Baltic states, I have still gathered on my conversations and my looking at public sentiments, whether it be through media, social media, etc. I get that's the general feeling in Eastern Europe outside of Poland and the Baltic states that they don't like Russia, but they're not going to die for Ukraine.
Right. And I think the biggest thing that's motivating, maybe not the biggest thing, but the one of the biggest things that's motivating the Poles who are willing to go there and willing to um, reason why they should go into Ukraine and fight is America has chosen Poland is the new European country with whom they're going to have a special relationship going forward. Many Poles are completely aware of this, and you know, of course, in 2022, they cut back their dependence on Russian oil. Also, I should mention the Druzhba pipeline, the one because it splits into two. Um,
Ah, yes, the friendship pipeline.
yes, the friendship pipeline. That one has been shut off by the Russians today. But Poland only takes about 10% Russian oil, and of course, everybody remembers just a couple of days after Nord Stream was blown up, they announced that the pipeline from Norway was online and ready. So I think they feel very poised to be in this leadership role. They love the attention that the Americans are giving them, and I think a lot of them feel like like some of the poorer countries, you could have some of them rationalizing, thinking like, okay, it's really, really going to hurt, but after we destroy Russia, we're going to get rich because all those resources will be ours. We'll never have to worry about Russia again. Um, it's a kind of like it's almost like a peasant mentality, and um, but with Poland, that's true too. But with Poland, of course, they're already in a place right now where they're not like say suffering as much as Romanians, Moldovans, Bulgarians, several other countries where inflation is through the roof. Even Germany, for that matter, right? And they like this. There's a certain amount of Schadenfreude that they're enjoying right now. So I think they feel particularly poised, but there's a significant part of the Polish population from my interactions with this Polish guy that um, they're actually quite worried about this thing escalating and dragging Poland into it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked by that because although ethnic feuds and national feuds do carry on, and although there might be seemingly a large bloodlust, when it becomes much more realistic, people's stomachs start to turn at the possibility
Mhm.
of it being them, their loved ones, their even just countrymen in general, being the ones who are spilling that blood rather than the people from several hundred miles away on a battlefield that doesn't really affect you at this point. And like I said, talk is one thing, action is something completely different.
Yeah.
But with that being said, I suppose just to round out European news, we do have some news about the expansion of NATO and some news out of Hungary. So, just to touch on that briefly, there has been some waffling on Hungary's part about the ascension of Finland and Sweden into NATO. So, this follows an address given by Orban in towards the beginning of this week. And just to touch on some brief points from that, Orban pledges to keep open relations with Russia, says they won't be cutting off Russia because of the country's national and economic interests, and that the economic relations will continue. And this is what we propose to our allies in Europe as well. And has once again also reaffirmed that Hungary will not send any weapons to Ukraine and is determined to stay out of the war. And On the question of Finland and Sweden being admitted into NATO, there does seem to be a willingness to capitulate on that, but it's a very begrudging willingness, and Orban's government is potentially in the sights of a color revolution. You did have the run of the mill State Department people, NGO people arriving in Hungary talking about why they're there and what causes they're going there to spread. So the pressure is being applied right now, and although Turkey is still at this point very much so a holdout on both of them, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe NATO admission is a unanimous process. I do believe it has to be,
It is.
yeah, approved 100%. And at that point, even if Hungary were to concede on that, you likely wouldn't have Turkey unless the results of the 2023 election bring in a very particular type of candidate into Turkey, in which case then you might actually get it. And the dynamic between Hungary and NATO and the European Union is a very complex one because one moment, once again, you have Orban giving a speech like that, talking about how vital it is that Hungary not get involved in the war, lodging complaints about the Ukrainian treatments of Hungarians. But on the other hand, his arm is being completely twisted on the question of Finland and Sweden in the NATO. Now, this has been something that had been hinted at before by the Orban government, but the way they had talked about it previously was something that they were going to kick the can down the road. And I get the impression of it this time. And I do think that there is a genuine dispute within the Hungarian government about how exactly to approach the situation. Is it worth the concession if it means taking a bit of heat off of it, or will that not even matter? Because, especially since the start of this war, Hungary has realized that its potential for cooperation with the West grows less and less every day. Now, it plays itself well within the EU and NATO system, both of which it said were vital to Hungarian national interest as part of Orban's speech. And because they're stuck there, let's just be honest about that. And it does make you wonder how much more dissent will be tolerated because this is a man who has stood up to the rainbow imperialism, what's entire country that stood up to the rainbow imperialism, has expelled a large amount of the NGOs, a large amount of the Soros-backed universities, and has continued ties with both Russia and China. And even within that speech and within that, you had Hungary praising the relationship with China, and I do believe they announced that Jarto is supposed to be having a summit with Chinese leadership at some point in the
Hmm.
near future. I don't think they gave a definitive date, but they said that that is something that is in the works, and that's on top of Jarto just having gotten back from Belarus. So it's a
Yep.
country that's certainly branching out, diversifying its options, but again, I still haven't wrapped my head around the Finland and Sweden in the NATO. And honestly, like I said, unless Erdogan is removed from power and replaced with somebody who has a drastically different vision than him, this is going to be an issue that is going to drag on for years.
Yeah, and I think, people have already kind of forgotten about it. The only way I could see why this issue would be important is if Ukrainian conflict is going to go cold, then there would be a demand for it. And I would dare say that it would be easier for Orban to agree to it, should that situation arise, because it gives him breathing room. Um, but that's the scenario I see being played out. Um, at the moment, it's not really priority. It's on a boiler, yes. It is something that they will eventually want to get to, but it's not the number one concern. And Orban, not forget, he went in a landslide. I mean, he
Super
decisively won the
majority.
last election. So, by the biggest margin, like 35 years. So, he's uh he's fine. As long as the domestic situation is okay, as long as the economy is okay. And I know it's struggling, they're suffering from a lot of high inflation, but as long as the economy is okay, you know, they will have to do something insane. They will have to, like, I don't know, and it's hard, right? Because Hungary doesn't have any debts. That's the kind of stuff that makes the IMF and Soros really mad.
Yeah,
So
I actually did not know that about the debt part. I knew that their financial situation did vary drastically from.
they have their own dollar, right?
Yeah,
They have their own currency. So it's hard to dictate them. It's very difficult to dictate to them the way the EU dictated towards Greece, for instance. They didn't fall for that. So, you know, well, like whatever methodology the Americans use, it will have to be pretty extreme, and that's not good because it will make America look like the aggressor. Um, so maybe that's one of the reasons why he's been able to withstand so much of the pressure, and as you say, branch out. Because going to Belarus, meeting with Xi Jinping, that's a pretty big deal. Those are the enemies. So, but I imagine, maybe when all of this is over, we're going to find out that there were lots of other European countries that, although were quiet about it, uh, endured the pressure and did not like where things were being taken. So,
yes, and I would be curious to see what kind of backdoor negotiations are ongoing because that's something I have often speculated about. Even once again, going back since the start of this program, that there are so many backdoor deals and negotiations going on that we really can't keep track of them, and especially in the question of Russia and China. And to touch on that Bloomberg story we covered earlier, depending on let's just take it at face value. Let's just say it's true. I don't know. I haven't fact checked. I haven't seen any sources like that corroborated it, but taking it at face value for the sake of argument, that
yeah,
means that I mean I think that's a prime example of that of them switching tankers in international waters outside the coast of Greece, which is a European Union and NATO country, in order to ship the oil into the European Union and NATO.
yeah,
So I can't imagine that is the only instance of that. You had
yes,
early in the war buying Russian energy. They're still taking in Russian uranium, despite the fact that they've tried to include it in the sanctions package. So Hungary, I think you're right. They are a much more brazen about this, I should say. But I would be remiss if other larger players in Europe, especially the French, especially the Germans, weren't conducting similar operations to Hungary at this point. Maybe in a much more subtle light, but given if there's any degree of self-preservation or self-interest left in the leadership of any of those countries, which I do think that is a real debate, especially in the case of Germany, then I would imagine they're doing likewise.
mhm. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that they're going to see is that the sanction packages are not working as intended, and the 10th package was finally agreed upon. So uh, this is going to affect several of Russian banks, including Alpha Bank. Um, there's another one. I forget the name of it. Uh, yeah, Tinkoff Bank, Ross Bank, and so on. Um, luxury good items are, because remember when the war started, like all shoes $1,000 and over. That's it. The Russians are not getting those gorgeous, expensive Imelda Marcos shoes. So they've upped that. Now they've thrown other luxury items. So it's not just tobacco and whatever. Like as if like I spoke with my Russian friend in St. Petersburg, and he says bro, like he's just showing me stuff that like is still there. He goes, there's no sanctions. Like I don't know what people are talking about. And as we said a few weeks ago, 76% of the companies who said they would leave have not left Russia. So a lot of this is, as you pointed out,
But they
with
lost
the
Pizza Hut and
transfer of
McDonald's.
oil.
Isn't that the most important part?
It truly is, yeah. With a touch and a burger. So, um, I know it's not. I just think it sounds funny
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
know what. Because it's the same. We use the same word in my language, so I know what it means. Um, a lot of this is just virtue signaling. Obviously, that's what it is. You have this very bloody kinetic war with massive losses on both sides, civilian losses, but a lot of this is just virtue signaling. America knows that Europe couldn't survive if they didn't get like you know fake Turkish oil that's or Greek oil that's actually Russian oil or Indian oil that's actually Russian oil.
Or at this
Everybody
point,
knows that.
Saudi oil that's actually Russian oil.
Yeah, exactly. Even the Saudis are selling Russian oil. So they know that they let it. They have to look away. You know. So a lot of it is just virtue signaling. Even now, even a year later.
Well, with all that being said, that's all I had for European news. So I'm just gonna brush through a few things briefly because we are getting up to
Yeah.
like the 2.5 hour mark. So there are talks of Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. That is not an original story by any means, but with Netanyahu back in power and with the growing global tensions, it's not unheard of. There is, of course, rising escalation around the Taiwan question, as there has been for a while. I won't get too much into it on this program, but I still maintain that, especially with the support of the KMT in Taiwan, who actually just did complete a state visit to mainland China, that a diplomatic solution is more likely than not still on the table, even just for the long term future. But the last main stories I have for this are the series of industrial incidences within the United States. And I just want to go over just a brief list of all the ones that I have seen this week. So you have a Union Pacific freight train that was carrying coal derailed in Nebraska. You had emergency crews respond to a uranium fire in Tennessee. And covering some of the ones outside of the U.S., there was a fire at a factory in Verona, Italy. There was a explosion of oil facilities in Mexico. In Cleveland, Ohio, there was an explosion at a steel plant this week. And that's just to name a few, just industrial accidents within the wake of the East Palestine issue and the following train derailments in South Carolina, Texas, and Michigan. And then, even more suspiciously, you had the environmental scientists who flew to Ohio to evaluate the East Palestine situation, all unfortunately perished in what is certainly just an aviation accident. And that happened about 3 days ago. And that was all combined with the Trump visit to East Palestine, Ohio, meeting with the local officials and the mayor there. And then you had Biden, who did not follow suit and said that he didn't plan on following suit to the visits. But I find myself once again asking the question I did about the East Palestine issue, that we are left with a few options, none of which particularly sit well. So this is either some sort of sabotage, foreign or domestic. I don't buy into that.
Mm.
This is some sort of, I don't know, maybe I guess you could fall under sabotage. Some sort of, I don't know, probably behind the scenes, maybe like some kind of insurance scam, something like that, trying to milk more money out of the government than it really can. And I would say sabotage implies something a bit more malicious versus just pure greed. Or, and here's actually the one I buy into, which is probably the most boring to people out there: the decades of neglect to American infrastructure and infrastructure on the world for that matter, as I did mention a couple that were outside of the country, such as the ones in Italy and Mexico, has led to a state where American infrastructure is falling into what can only be described as a state of utter disrepair. And I think you'll all recall during the early days of the Trump campaign him saying, especially on the lines of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we spent $6 trillion over there while our infrastructure crumbled. Successive administrations from Obama onward, Obama, Trump, Biden, have all passed massive infrastructure spending bills, including the most recent one, which was within a week of the East Palestine derailment. And this, look, they can put Pete Buttigieg, or however you say his name, up there and say, well, there's however many train derailments a year, blah, blah, blah. And look, I haven't taken the time, I haven't put out a spreadsheet to calculate train derailments this year versus the average compared to previous years. But if I had to just go on observation, and correct me if I'm wrong, if there's anyone who has put that spreadsheet together, this is a market escalation. And this is also within the context of, throughout 2021, just the slew of accidents at particularly food processing plants, particularly involving chickens. And I mean, you can look at the price of eggs now if you want an idea of the outcome of that. Where, while I don't put malice past particularly the feds or even outside actors, again, take your wager on who that might be. There's about 1.5 million people who that could be. But I still maintain in both those cases it is a terminal decline of American infrastructure, and it's a problem that until this most recent train derailment happened in East Palestine, Ohio, had been more or less completely swept under the rug, even by, maybe swept under the rug isn't the right term, but collectively ignored, even by people in our circles, and even admittedly by myself as well. And
Mm.
I would have to observe what is going to happen in the future. I would have to see more of a trend before I start to draw any conclusions. But one thing I'm going to try to do for the interest of the public and of this show is to try to just keep a running tally of these industrial accidents whenever I see them, and try to give a show by show report of what happens then, to see, is it just cherry picking? Am I just too hyper focused on this? Or is there actually a trend developing? Because I do think that is a worthwhile thought experiment. So if there's anything you see that you would like to share with the show, just leave it in the comments. I'll look into it. We can make this a collaborative effort in that regard to look into, is this a growing trend?
Mm.
But that is what I had for the question of the industrial sector in the United States and the seeming uh, terminal
It's it's
decline.
really hard to tell, to be quite honest. Like, you would even have to ask yourself, like, why is it publicized so much now? Is it pressure from alternative media? They know people are posting this stuff on TikTok and so on. Because I'll be honest with you, when I returned, I was away on vacation for a few days visiting a friend. But on my drive back, another friend of mine picked me up, and he's very familiar with the railroad, and he was speaking with a guy that works for the railroad, and they basically talked about, there's a lot of derailments, and there's a lot of um, oversight that's not being properly fulfilled, and the government much of the time is to blame, and a lot of things go wrong, and uh, I get that. I suppose one has to look at how many derailments were there in 2022, 2020. 2020, 2019, etc. See if there's a pattern, right? You know, one of the things I found out today was that vinyl product. People are calling it chocolate vinyl because the actual name is quite difficult to remember. But that's not even allowed to be transported in China, right? So,
Oh, and
and
that
it's not just the emergency brakes, although my friend's friend scoffed at the idea of emergency brakes because he felt like there are so many other parts, like the bearings. He literally was on a train where the bearing was like red hot, and they had to stop the train, and they did just in time. So, but that's not the only thing. I mean, there have been all kinds of food processing places or storage places that have gone up in flames. And I mean, like you, I'm going to be hesitant saying one thing or the other, but I can understand why people would think like there's a conspiracy to get them, because the last 2 years aren't exactly years that would like convince you to trust the government. You can't blame them. I mean, the entire trust has been eroded.
I would certainly agree, and there is no benefit of the doubt to be given to the government at this point. And one of the other possibilities I had heard somebody bring up that I don't entirely subscribe to, but I do think is an interesting angle, that a lot of these, especially when it comes to these train derailments, and some of them reported that they saw signs of sabotage, that this could be the making of what could really just be called a false flag. And I think that also is something to put in mind to drum something up for our next intervention. And I do. I'm glad you brought up the China point because I did want to point out. Now, China is a country that is infamous for its industrial accidents, and
Hmm.
it was a well-deserved reputation up until the last few years. Now, the last few years, I'm not saying it's a completely solved problem, but there has been marked improvements. But it was one of the countries that was did have that reputation for a reason, and even they didn't allow the transportation of those hazardous materials by train. And
Hmm.
here's the real kicker. I think I mentioned this on the last episode, but I can't remember, so I'll just say it again. It does bear repeating if I did. That these materials are transferred safe by pipeline. And although it was particularly the oil and natural gas pipelines that were being shut down, again, pipelines across the country were being shut down ever since Biden assumed office. And these, once again, are an objectively safer way to measure that. So I think that could be. I don't want to hazard any sort of guess whether that's more a malicious or incompetent act because I think there's a fair amount of room to say both and
Yeah.
uh, maybe
They don't
complete.
all have to be one or the other.
Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, perhaps it's just a matter of negligence that these things just get overlooked because they're considered of secondary importance because they aren't these grand imperial projects. They aren't intervening in a war in Ukraine. It's only keeping the floor from under you from caving in. But what does that matter? That's the concerns of the plebeians. But it's not unbelievable that this isn't some sort of malicious act by the government, but that they're just so short-sighted, especially when it comes to all their other ambitions, that they just let these things go completely to the wayside.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's all I had for that. I don't know if you have any other last-minute stories, but if
Uh,
so,
Um, yeah. Just to clarify, I was talking earlier about the German government and businesses. So it is actually the German government. It was in an article in Die Welt am Sonntag, and they're negotiating for um, fixing up a little bit of the damaged pipelines of Nord Stream 2. I mean, I just wanted to clarify that. I won't reiterate the points I made, but there it is. Because I was searching for the article in my notes, and there's a back. The only other thing I'll say is there's been a kind of a back and forth about spending for Ukraine, right? So of course the Biden respecters and the Zelensky respecters are saying no, it's not true. We've spent more money than Afghanistan. Well, the, as it stands now, um, this doesn't include military aid, and it's according to a publication named Statista, which is using the source from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. $46.6 billion for Ukraine um, in 1 year versus 43.4 billion for Afghanistan from 2001 to 2010. So, yes, if you include all 20 years in Afghanistan, you're right. But the course that the U.S. is on, it is going to outspend it, which is incredible. But you look at the amount of billions that were spent for the Korean War. My God, it was even more than the Iraq War or Vietnam.
That,
So,
yeah,
anyways, I
that's
thought that was interesting.
yeah, that is quite shocking, and those are numbers to keep in mind, especially as the American debt continues to creep up. Now, I know a lot of you will say, and I'm rather sympathetic to the argument that the American debt is a bit irrelevant considering the amount of American power has, but once again, as American power declines, that debt becomes more and more real.
If there's any sane, rational deal, it will be between America and the other big powers to deal with the American debt. Some kind of debt forgiveness for uh, stop provoking World War III. That's what it will come down to. And I know I promised that would be it, but uh, the Polish Youth Agency caught um, Zelensky's double on camera
Oh,
as
yes.
as Biden was visiting. I couldn't help it. That's just hilarious. Anyways, look for it on Telegram. But that's
Imagine
all I
being
have.
that poor man. Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We will see you all next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.